It seems ironic, doesn't it, that when Donald Trump's stance on Ukraine is so overwhelming that it could be bottled and sold as an American export, if only the grand old party, the Republicans, still believed in free trade. At a moment when Ukraine is demonstrably succeeding in resisting Russian aggression on the battlefield, when Putin's war machine is visibly disintegrating and deteriorating before our eyes, when Moscow is reduced to sending donkeys and camels to the front line and struggling to access butter because its supply chains are collapsing, this is the precise moment Trump chooses to throw in the towel for Ukraine and hand Putin a victory on a silver platter. Trump's long-standing admiration for Putin, his disdain for NATO, his America first, or more accurately, America alone, doctrine have all coalesced into what looks like an impending betrayal of Ukraine and, by extension, of Western security as a whole. If Trump were even marginally interested in easy political victories, supporting Ukraine would be the most straightforward triumph of his presidency. Here's why. 3 reasons. First of all, the Russian war effort is crumbling and their rail networks are collapsing, their oil refineries are ablaze, their aviation industry is in freefall, pun. Ukraine has successfully crippled Russian logistics, and drone strikes inside Russia have rattled Moscow's sense of invulnerability. Secondly, Ukraine is the most pro-American nation in the world. If Trump wanted statues of himself in foreign countries, Ukraine would be the first to erect them, if he ensured their survival. The idea that Trump, who thrives on adulation, would turn down an opportunity for an erection of himself for a historic statue-worthy success is baffling. The third point is the economic logic favours continued aid. The United States' biggest trading partner is Europe, and a Russian victory would destabilise EU economies, wreck confidence in NATO, and undermine American business interests. Supporting Ukraine is not charity, it's sound economic and global strategy. And yet, despite this, Trump is on the verge, or appears to be on the verge, of gifting Russia everything that Putin wants, not because it makes sense, but because his movement is now internally divided over what exactly the MAGA worldview is supposed to be. At the heart of Trump's hesitancy is the deepening schizophrenia of MAGA momentum. His followers are being pulled in multiple directions. Tucker Carlson and the pro-Putin win. Carlson, who once postured as an anti-establishment contrarian, is now openly parroting Kremlin propaganda, arguing that backing Ukraine is a deep state conspiracy. Tosh. Piers Morgan and the cheerleading opportunist Morgan, hardly a mastermind, has somehow inserted himself into the MAGA debate, flip-flopping between cheerleading Trump and acknowledging the reality of Putin's brutality. And then there's the traditional GOP hawks, the traditional Republican hawks, the more old-school national security conservatives who still understand the basic concept of American power are quietly fuming that Trump is about to hand Putin a free pass. Trump, ever the opportunist, hates internal conflict within his base, and he craves uniformity of adoration, hence his vacillation on Ukraine. The end result, an incoherent foreign policy that Putin is exploiting. And much of Trump's reluctance to back Ukraine stems from a profoundly outdated perception of Russian strength. The reality is that Russia can barely sustain its war effort. Sanctions, battlefield attrition, logistical failures have turned its military into a hollowed-out shell, is facing economic collapse, and Western restrictions on oil and gas, coupled with Ukraine's targeted strikes, are crippling Russia's ability to sustain the war. And Russia has failed at every strategic objective. Kyiv didn't fail. Kyiv didn't fall. Ukraine didn't collapse. Ukraine continues. Russia is forced to ration everything from tanks to trained soldiers, and yet the Kremlin refuses to back down because Putin cannot survive without war. And this is the paradox. Putin is trapped. It doesn't matter whether he's in a Smeg fridge or whether he's in a Kremlin office or in some little palace elsewhere pretending he's in a Kremlin office. His economy is a war economy. If this war ends, his regime implodes. Unlike the West, whose leaders can lose elections and move on to lucrative speaking gigs, Putin has no exit strategy at all. That doesn't involve exile or death or a continued existence in a fridge. His survival depends on perpetual conflict. A major fallacy in Trump's thinking, one shared by many of the isolationist wing of his party, is that Russia has red lines that the West must respect. This is nonsense. Over the past 3 years, Russia has threatened nuclear retaliation every time Ukraine or the West has taken bold action. And what happened? Nothing. Ukraine has struck inside Russian territory. Nothing. The West has supplied long-range missiles, tanks and F-16s. Nothing. The Russian Black Sea fleet has been systematically dismantled. Nothing. Russia's red lines are a bluff, a psychological weapon to intimidate risk-averse Western leaders, and yet Trump appears genuinely afraid of upsetting Putin, despite branding himself the world's greatest deal-maker. If Trump follows through on his implied surrender to Russia, the consequences will be catastrophic. Ukraine will fight on nevertheless. Even without US aid, Ukraine has no choice but to resist. Surrender is not an option. The fight will become grindingly difficult, but it would not end. Europe will be forced to take up the slack. The EU will reluctantly step up its military contributions, but it will lack the speed and the firepower that the US can provide. Putin will expand his ambitions with a perceived victory in Ukraine. Why would he stop? Moldova, the Balkans, even part of Central Asia could become his next target. History shows that appeasement emboldens aggressors, and China will take note. If the US abandons Ukraine, Beijing will see an opening to escalate its pressure on Taiwan, convinced the Americans will no longer have the willpower to protect the Allies. Trump's reluctance to take back to back Ukraine isn't just a betrayal of an ally, it's a betrayal of America's own strategic interests. Ukraine's success is a rare political option, and yet Trump seems determined to fumble the ball on the goal line. He's been thrown the ball, and he's in with a chance of a goal, and yet he's throwing it somewhere else. If he were playing the art of the deal, he would see that arming Ukraine is the cheapest way to ensure Russia's decline without shedding a single American life. But instead, he's poised to gift Putin a win, not because it's good for America, but because he's afraid of upsetting the wrong faction of his base, and he wants to play to this time limit that he can provide peace. In the end, history will remember this moment not as an act of strong leadership, but as an act of self-inflicted weakness. A nation that spent decades fighting the Cold War to contain Moscow is now being undone by one man's ego and an incoherent, confused political moment. It's an act of indecision, stupidity, incoherence, and incontinence. It's incontinent politics. And the irony is as thick as the Russian winter. The question is, will Trump recognize it before it's too late?